This past week, I actually spent the week with my family in Eastern Europe. And the thing that came out of that trip really was a reminder of the power of history. And so when I'm talking today, I'm going to put a little bit of my remarks in the context of history. I was traveling along the Danube and areas there that much of that civilized society there dates back to the Roman Empire and then through a series of other empires. And as I was touring it, one of the guides reminded me that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And so I'm going to try to refresh our memory a little bit here today and think about both what happened historically as well as what that means for the future. So I've titled this Some Lessons from Southern California, as well as moving into the next wave. Since we were here last year, one of the most significant events for AES in the work that we've been doing with energy storage is the large projects that we put on in Southern California in cooperation with San Diego Gas and Electric. When we were here last, a year ago, these projects hadn't yet been conceived of. We weren't talking about them. There wasn't a solicitation. There wasn't any activity at all. There was an emergent problem that called for the need for new capacity in the San Diego area to be deployed very, very quickly. And so this whole process took place in between these annual conferences, from an identification of a need, the opening of a solicitation, choosing a supplier, and then the building of the largest battery system in the world at Escondido. This is a picture of that unit at Escondido. It's a 30 megawatt lithium ion advanced-ion energy storage system that AES deployed in coordination with San Diego Gas and Electric. It's a 4-hour duration system, so 120 megawatt hours of storage capacity located on a little bit less than an acre near a substation in Escondido. A critical location for San Diego Gas and Electric, one in which it would have been very challenging for them to place any kind of conventional resource. And this was deployed in about 6 months. So very, very rapid procurement process, implementation, permitting, deployment, commissioning process. Really much quicker than you would see with any type of conventional asset at all. And this project alone is the largest in the world. It's 50% larger than the next largest grid battery system that's installed today. That would have been challenging enough, but San Diego decided they wanted a second project at the same time. So in parallel with this, we deployed a 7.5 megawatt, 4-hour duration system in El Cajon in the San Diego service area. So in total, almost 40 megawatts, almost double the next largest project, and again, all done in 6 months. I bring this up right at the start of my talk to say this is kind of the current state of things. This is the largest today, but this became the largest being deployed a month after the prior project that had become the largest. And so we're seeing this rapid acceleration in scale of size of projects and duration of projects as utilities like San Diego Gas and Electric are looking at storage to solve real problems that they have. Very significant needs that they've been solving different ways in the past with conventional resources, with distribution and transmission solutions. They're now looking and finding that storage is the cost-effective, better solution to those kinds of problems. And it can be moved onto the grid very, very, very quickly. This project, in my mind, and this whole collection of projects that went on, about 100 megawatts went on in Southern California towards the beginning of this year, is really a bit of a watershed moment. In this industry, we often look for inflection points. And this is one where I think we're starting to see an inflection point, moving towards long duration, moving towards larger scale, and moving towards large systems owned by the utility. So we designed, constructed, installed this system, and it's owned by San Diego Gas and Electric. It's their advanced-ion system that we work in conjunction with them to help support and operate over time. Another significant point, and why I point out this as being a bit of an inflection point, when I date back to some of the things that AES has done over the 10 years that we've been involved with energy storage, this system is about 15 times more dense in terms of battery storage capability in the footprint than we have than the systems we were building in 2008 and 2009. It's about 85% less expensive on a megawatt hour basis than the systems we were building just 7 or 8 years ago. So we've seen massive increase in the amount of energy that you can store in a footprint and massive decrease in the cost that it takes to store that. That's the curve that we're on right now. And these systems are becoming the norm. As you can see, this is a footprint that we can duplicate. We can do it in this kind of form factor, or we can do it in a building type form factor, depending on what is needed. In this particular case, this site was quite constrained. And we were limited by the challenges of getting the system deployed in 6 months, which meant we couldn't go through a very extensive or long permitting process. So we had severe limitations on how much ground could be disturbed, on even the length of the way the conduit and cable could go in had to be stacked, multiple processes going on the site simultaneously in order to achieve the goals that San Diego had. Very ambitious goals, a very exciting project, a great customer to work with, a great utility that's really leading the way here forward. With that, actually, let me step back for a second. Who here has had a Snapple ever in your life? Gotta be more than that, okay. Snapple has done us a bit of a service in that they've also decided to be a historical record keeper in addition to selling juice. This is a Snapple cap that I got in 2007 when I was starting to work on electric vehicles and energy storage. And this reads, in 1900, 1/3 of all automobiles in New York City were powered by electricity. So Snapple is reminding us of our history and where we started with this. And at the beginning, in the advent of the transportation sector, the idea of electric-powered vehicles wasn't so strange. We didn't have 100 years of history of internal combustion engines. We were still trying to find the path. So right at the beginning, electricity was thought to be one of the paths we would see. Another question, who here subscribes to an engineering journal of any sort? Does anybody subscribe to the Engineering News? We know that publication still. Do any of you have the issue from 1893? No? Okay. Well, this is a quote from that article, in case you missed it, in 1893, showing the load curve and how in New York they were managing load with batteries in cooperation with generation and other services on the grid, using the battery to discharge and charge at different points of the day to manage imbalances in supply and demand and make a cost-effective power system. So again, right at the beginning of the power system introduction, 120 years ago, we had batteries on the grid. That was the way we thought we would build the grid going forward. Right at the beginning of the electric sector, right at the beginning of the transportation sector, this is the way we thought things should be. We know a little bit more of the story. I would call this kind of time zero or point zero if we think about it from a historical standpoint. And I'll reference that as I go through some other remarks, but what happened here? Why didn't this go forward? Well, unfortunately, the technology of the day really didn't support what we needed it to do. And so we found some alternate ways to progress automobiles. We found some alternate ways to progress the electric grid, and we took other means rather than continuing to use storage. But right from the beginning, we had this concept. My friend Craig Horn, in a former incarnation, used to tell me energy doesn't like to be stored. And so maybe that's the reason why we didn't continue with this path. But it's starting to like to be stored a little bit more, and our technologies have evolved to the point where we can do a lot more than we could do in 1893 and 1900. So today, what do we see? If we think about these trends, and we think about where we were 100 years ago, and now we think about where we are today, we see three real key trends. And these are trends that have carried through history, but they're ones that we see as very powerful right now. One is a move to electrify everything. And that is moving into transportation, it's moving everywhere. Generally, most of the rest of our economy has electrified. Electricity is fundamentally a great way to harness work. It's cheaper, it's cleaner, it's more effective than the other forms of power that we found for almost everything. So there's a continuous move to electrify everything that's now moving into transportation, one of the more challenging fields. We're seeing an acceleration in renewables. This isn't a surprise, but this is happening at a speed that even just a few years ago, we would have found very surprising. If we went back just a couple of these ESA conferences ago, to think about solar PV at the prices that we're seeing it today, in the places that we're seeing it all over the world, at the scale that it's being implemented, is just astounding and surprising. There were solar moonshot programs that we've surpassed the pricing of already that were intended to be far into the future. And we see this happening on every front in every place. And then finally, we see a third trend here, which is to transform the way that we interact with the grid through using energy storage. And we believe that these three trends really lead to a future new energy network, a different way of thinking about our power system. This isn't going to be some little overlay. This is going to become the fabric of how we think about power systems into the future. We're going to have renewables embedded very deeply and very significantly all throughout the system at all layers. We're going to have electrified devices all over the place interacting as load and supply at different times. and we're going to have storage located in many, many different places. We recently worked together with IHS on a white paper. If you hadn't had the chance to see that paper, it's located here at the AS Energy Storage website. You can get a copy of it there. There's also a rebroadcast of a webinar that we did a few weeks ago. But in this research, one of the things that IHS came to the conclusions on were that when they looked across all kinds of networks, all different types of networks, virtual networks, physical networks, distribution networks, they see storage as a fundamental element of networks, of efficiently operating effective networks. And that storage combined with communication strengthens networks. What they also found was that the electric power system has a distinct lack of storage, and we're now starting to see technologies emerge that allow us to address that. Part of that is from declining costs, part of that is from the emergence of new technology, and that as you look at these other networks and you take the lessons from them, storage isn't located just at one place in those other networks. It's often located at multiple locations. So the debates that we're having right now about behind the meter, in front of the meter, central, decentralized, those are all debates that I think are a moment in time. We will see storage find its economic place, its useful place, its reliable place, all throughout these networks, all throughout the grid, in many different ways, the way we see it in other types of networks. This is because storage performs a very fundamental function. It allows us to deliver things less expensively. It allows us to deliver them more reliably. These are not add-on values. These are fundamental values of networks. We want the network to perform reliably. One way to do that is to overbuild the network. That's a costly way to do it. We end up in systems where we have idle capacity. We've seen that in telecom. We've seen it in distribution and warehousing. We've seen a massive move to just-in-time inventory. We've seen telecommunications take advantage of IP technologies and data warehousing. Other technologies allow us to get higher and higher utilization of bandwidth. And today, we see this now occurring in the electric sector, where we often have power generators that are used 5, 6, 7% of the time if it's a peaker, 40, 50, 60, 70% of the time if it's a combined cycle unit or highly utilized unit. A lot of spare capacity that's intended to meet various times of the year when we need it, but we don't really need it all the time. We build our electric power transmission network out the same way. We have a lot of redundancy and reliability because we haven't had storage. And those are expensive costs that we've embedded into our social infrastructure that we continue to pay for, that storage will allow us to get away from. If we had an architecture and a system that was allowing us to store electricity at key points for key moments in time, we could eliminate a lot of this overbuild that's very expensive. It's a very heavy drag. And so storage is not something that gets added. It's actually something very fundamental to this. This is a challenge that we've had in the industry. In the 10 years that I've been working on energy storage and the 10 years that I've been coming to ESA presentations, we've struggled to find the right metric of value to communicate this simply to people. We've had a complicated message. We've had a difficult time conveying why somebody does storage. And we always end up in conversations that make it seem like we're trying to get somebody to buy an expensive additional thing. This is not the cherry on top. Some people in our area have described it as the bacon. You know, it makes the sandwich better. It's an add-on. I think that's buying into the wrong mindset. I don't think storage is bacon, and I know bacon. I've had my fair share of bacon, believe me. It isn't something we add on to make my sandwich expensive and tasty. Storage is actually very fundamental. It's what we need. And when we look at every other type of network in the world, we see storage there as something that reduces total costs and improves reliability. And that's what we're starting to see now in the power sector. Unfortunately, today, we don't have much. And so if you compare it to other types of networks and other kinds of power systems, or not power systems, but other kinds of distribution systems, we have much, much less storage. We have very little. We really have pumped storage in some places. And that pumped storage was largely built to help us balance out fluctuations so that we could run nuclear power plants more consistently. And every place we have that storage, it serves the purposes that I'm talking about. It's reducing cost, it's adding reliability by letting us optimize the way we use all of the other resources and not having to overbuild the grid, not having to overbuild our generation. If you just look at this example, in other networks that we're commonly using every day, the gas storage network, lots of storage there. They deal with interseasonal storage to make sure that we don't have to have massive production of gas and transshipment of gas in the instant we need it. In the perishable goods, we've got refrigeration, we've got storage warehouses so that we don't have to produce all of the goods we need. Even in this particular area, what it's allowed us to do is avoid some of the gluts and seasonality that comes with this. We don't have to eat all the blueberries when they're immediately harvested. We can freeze blueberries, we can extend the season, we can grow them in different places and transport. We can have blueberries year-round now because we have storage. And that's the same kind of thing that we're moving towards in the electric sector. We need to move away from 20 minutes. We need to move to some more rational level and reduce the costs and the burdens that we've put on our system. Now, where are we? This is the world's first grid battery that was ever qualified to serve as a market resource in a power system. We called this Project Barbados. We worked on this in cooperation with the PJM interconnection. And this went online in the parking lot of the PJM headquarters in Norristown, Pennsylvania. Terry Boston, that used to lead that organization, liked to say he could look out his window and see that he had an advanced battery on his grid, and he was the only one in the world. And he loved that. This was a 1 megawatt system, 250 kilowatt hours, the first unit qualified to be an active resource in PJM as a battery, and it supplied frequency regulation and was cleared and settled just like any other power generator providing frequency regulation. This was in 2008. Incidentally, I was talking to you about the project we did in California that's 30 megawatts, 150 megawatt hours, took us about 6 months. This project actually took us about 6 months too to build 1 megawatt, 250 kilowatt hours. So we've gotten a little bit quicker in our older age as we've grown up here and scaled. When this went in 2008, it was the only battery connected to a grid anywhere serving these commercial purposes and interacting like another power unit. 9 years have gone by now in PJM, a number of rule changes, a number of ways to encourage storage to come in. 34 additional projects have been built in the PJM interconnection, about 118 megawatt hours of total capacity that have been built over 9 years. And we've built several of those projects ourselves. At the time, this was the largest, this 1 megawatt. This was our first largest, but we've since surpassed that. This 118 megawatt hours that took us 9 years to build, we just built 150 megawatt hours in 2 projects in California in 6 months, just AES. So the speed and the pace of change is really accelerating. Just recent projects in 6 months have overtaken what took 9 years to do in the most active market in the world for storage. And we weren't the only ones building projects. If you combine the other projects that went on in and around the Aliso Canyon expedited procurement, you have almost 300 megawatt hours of storage systems that were deployed in about a 6-month window. So that's the capability of the industry. If you work with companies that have a large supply chain, that already have a design in place, and have the experience to move these things forward, we're seeing this acceleration to meet real problems and real challenges that utilities are facing. And it's not just happening in the US. I want to talk a little bit about things that are happening in other parts of the world. Since we were here a year ago, this is a project that's gone online in the Dominican Republic, serving that grid there. An islanded system, great challenges of system stability and cost. This is built and deployed an Advancion system there. We've also done a similar project since we've talked last in the Philippines, another island grid, high expensive system where they're facing internal grid challenges of cost and reliability, but also facing an advent of renewables and solar coming in. So this system will help them reduce costs today, and it will also prepare them for a future where they have a lot more variable generation. And then finally, since we were here last, we've announced a grid-scale project in India as well. This will be the first large-scale storage project to be done in India. This is coexisting with very significant targets that they have for solar generation and for expansion of their grid to meet energy needs and basic services. And so we're working together with partners in Mitsubishi and Tata Delhi Distribution to put a large-scale system into India. So just a few examples of things that are going on in lesser-known places of the world that are starting to catch up. It's not going to take us 9 years in other parts of the world to get to where it took us 9 years in the United States. It's going to take us a couple years. They're building on the lessons that we've done here. They're taking advantage of the supply chain, the experience, and other things to do these same kinds of projects in other places in the world. And they're rapidly moving from the stage of initial introduction with short duration systems for frequency to projects that are more capacity oriented, really more fundamental, longer duration, 2, 3, 4 hour duration systems that can replace peaking, can replace transmission congestion, and serve lots of other jobs. So where do we go from here? Matt Roberts at the introduction and his remarks talked about a 35 gigawatt market in the US in 2025, an installed base of 35 gigawatts of storage as the outlook from ESA. That's just focused on the US. We see that as an enormous accomplishment from where we are today. That would be tremendous growth, and it will keep a lot of us running over the next 10 years the way I've been running over the last 10 years. But still, at 35 gigawatts, storage will only represent about 3.5% of the installed capacity of the United States. So it will still be a relatively small piece of the pie with lots of growth ahead of it, lots of opportunities for storage to add those fundamental values of reduced costs and additional reliability, not to mention helping us with emissions. If we take and project that to the rest of the world, and we just assume the US represents 50% of the market, you see something like 70 gigawatts by 2025. Today, the US represents 20 to 25% of the electric consumption of the world, but it's been leading in storage, so it's likely to believe that we would be a little bit ahead in installed base. If it goes down to a third, you're talking about over 100 gigawatts globally installed from where we are today. Massive, rapid adoption. This seems a little bit ludicrous until we look at what's happened in solar. We looked at what can happen with industries that are driven by material science, where most of the materials are produced in a factory. They're distributed and deployed in a very rapid fashion by lots and lots of companies, and we can get to these scales very quickly. So this is a bit of the future. This is maybe where we're going. Let me step back just from there. So what does all of this mean? And maybe to tie this together with a historical perspective, I started 120 years ago and said that was time zero. If you look back about 40 years, we had another little brush with energy storage when the Office of Science and Technology was giving testimony to create what has become the investment tax credit program that fuels much of our renewable industry. At the time, they speculated that we would have batteries to support grids because that would be the best way to integrate renewables and make sure that we didn't overpay and overbuild the network systems. And so back in mid-1970s, when we didn't really have any of the battery technologies that we're depending on today, they wrote into the rules the idea that batteries would be part of this investment tax credit program. That's what allowed batteries to qualify in pairing it with a renewable to get any of these investment tax credits. We discovered that when we were working through the first private letter ruling to combine wind and energy storage under the ITC program a few years ago, like in 2011. We came across congressional testimony and reports from 40 years ago, and it felt a little bit like discovering something lost. You know, if anybody knows American history, you find if time zero was Columbus discovering America back 120 years ago, this was kind of like the lost colony of Roanoke, you know, in Virginia, where all we have left is a little bit of a signpost on the wall. We have this congressional testimony that everyone forgot about, but it's kind of embedded in there where people were continuing to think, surely storage is fundamental to a network. We thought it 120 years ago. We thought it 40 years ago. Both of those times we didn't have the technologies. Then next we kind of had the pilgrim phase is what I would call it, which is the first people coming across the ocean. Those are the projects that were done in the 90s. They didn't work very well. They proved that storage was beneficial, but again, the technology was a bit premature. That's when ESA was founded, and we started to have a group like this thinking about how do we pool our resources as an industry to get this benefit. And that followed the pioneer stage in the 2000s, mid-2000s, late 2000s, with people doing the initial scale projects like I showed you, Barbados, several others that we've done over the last 8 to 10 years. And now we're moving to what I'm calling the next wave. The next wave is really the settler wave. Okay? This is where the pioneers have made it across. We know that it's possible to do this. We have enough projects that we can see the benefits of storage. They've been successfully deployed, and now the masses are coming. Every year this conference gets bigger. This topic appears in more and more places. It's starting to make its way into policy statements at the highest levels of government in all places around the world. And that's the settler phase. And in this phase, what's going to be important as these wagon trains set off across the US to a land that they don't really know is to have a guide that has some experience with this, to have a guide that has tools that are properly prepared. We've been doing projects for a number of years in a number of locations all different kinds of systems and technologies coordinated together to build this Advancion platform that we supply to others. They own and operate it. We help them design and install it. There's others like us that are doing the same thing, a few others that have similar experiences. And I think as we move forward in this settler period, we want to make sure that the settlers get to the other side. We want to make sure that California gets settled. We want to make sure that not every message coming back of the travel across the plains is the Indians got them, right? So we got to get some things to the other side. We got to bind together as an industry and make sure that the projects that we're doing are sensible, they provide value, and we're growing them at scale. We've been doing that for 10 years. It's been an exciting ride. And that's a little bit of how I'm tying this all together with history. And we think back to 120 years ago, we wanted storage. We see it as fundamental to networks. And today the technologies are in front of us and have been proven to show us that there's a value here in reliability and cost affordability. Thank you very much.
Great, John. I think that's an interesting thought that we have crossed the oceans, we have set out, and now there's settlers, right? These small encampments, they're stable, people are farming, they're going to sustain themselves. So the question I have for you is sort of recognizing that that's where this is. There's still, obviously, folks looking over each other's shoulders, saying, oh, what are you doing? And a lot of, I think, competition because still, the opportunities are not as many as we would like to see. So what is your thought in terms of how an industry supports itself while at the same time recognizing that everyone, still competing?
It's not all going to be kumbaya, I guess, is the first. But no, I've said in past years here that, we're still a relatively small group in energy storage, and we've had complexity to explain. It's more complex than explaining what solar or wind does. And a lot of the benefits are embedded in the broader network system. And so we have that challenge of education. I think, when you look at this conference, we've achieved greatness. I mean, we've come from a few hundred people getting together to a few thousand people getting together. But we're still not at tens of thousands of people getting together where we see the solar and wind industries. And so to me, it's about building this community and making sure that when we do have the types of opportunities that come out, we're making sure that they're good programs. I'll give you a good example of this. Most recently in India, they launched a program to do solar and storage together. And I think the idea of that, the ministry that was engaged in it was very powerful. They really wanted to make sure that they were advancing the state of knowledge about energy storage within their country, and they see storage as fundamental. Prime Minister Modi talks about storage all the time, in conjunction with the 100 gigawatts of solar that they're planning to put online over the next 5 years. He sees it as a core item that they need to do. But in designing that solicitation, they really didn't understand what storage would do, and so they had very light demands on it. It really only needed to survive for 4 years, even though the rest of the solar facility had to have 15 plus years. And so you end up creating a system where it's generally encouraging storage to show up, but it's doing it in such a way that we're going to end up with an end product that isn't going to demonstrate the benefits of storage. And I think as an industry, when we see things like that, that's an opportunity for all of us to come together and say, listen, this isn't the right way to show that storage is a value to this society. This is a demonstration that's going to show it's just an expensive add-on to a solar facility. So I think those are great examples. Now, once the rules are set and once the thing is released, we compete with one another, and that's natural. And I think that's showing great progress. It's bringing new solutions. The costs are coming down rapidly. When we were at the commissioning for the Escondido site that I showed, Chairman Picker in California, his comments at the mark were, he said, we're seeing costs in 2017 that are below what we thought we would see in 2020 when we initiated the storage targets in California. So a market aimed at real needs, running real procurements, progresses really very rapidly.
So, it's interesting. There's actually a question here from the audience. That rapid decline, in some respects, do you see a Moore's law concerning battery energy density or any other aspect of the performance of energy storage?
Yeah. I mean, I think we see similar phenomenons. I don't think we found more yet. Maybe we need our own name for a law, but we certainly see the density increasing. We see the cost coming down, and it's not just being fueled by us. It's being fueled by the auto sector and consumer electronics and other things that are trying to do detached battery-based services. So the nice thing is that we're building as an industry on trends that exist and that are broader than just what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, to that end, there's another question from the audience, not to put you too much on the spot, but who are the competitors that are keeping you up at night when you know that there's other things happening out there as well?
My travel schedule is mostly keeping me up at night. I think that's probably the biggest thing. But I don't think it's competitors so much that keep me up at night. I think it's, as I said, I started in this in 2007. We formed AS Energy Storage in 2007. Just prior to that, I was telling some people earlier, I had attended a California Air Resources Board conference that looked at technology evolution, and they were looking out in the future. And every time batteries on the grid came up in this 2-day symposium, it was just shouted down. It really was a non-starter, and the reason wasn't cost. The reason was no one believed that batteries were ever going to be rigorous enough to survive the needs of the power sector. That was 2006. In 2017, we have all kinds of storage systems, not just in the United States, but all over the world, in all different kinds of states. And so conventional wisdom changes. And I think the thing that keeps me up at night is, how do we educate more? How do we get more people to see the kinds of things, the conclusions that San Diego Gas and Electric's come to, the kinds of conclusions that Arizona Public Service, that Hawaii Electric Company, that National Grid in the UK, that many, many places around the world, they've come to understand storage is really one of the tools that they need on the grid.
So, and I think keeping with that, obviously a changing understanding in education, certainly a base condition for entering any given market, so folks understand what its value is and what it's supposed to be doing. What global markets do you see as having the right conditions for market acceleration, and what are those conditions beyond just education? Yeah,
and I would say there's probably fall into two categories. There's ones where we see very strong underlying needs, and those tend to be where there's high constraints. And so islands fall naturally into that category. But there's other power systems that have either physical barriers or electrical barriers where they just have a natural constraint, and it's costing them a lot of money. It's costing it either in an overbuild of the transmission and distribution infrastructure, or it's costing them in every incremental use of power. So that's one area where there's a driving need in that case. The other is that we have some places where they've sort of broadly accepted and adopted storage into the market rules. And so we've seen a lot of activity in the UK recently as one of those markets. Australia has been in the news quite a lot because they have a crisis situation, similar to the crisis situation that came up in California, where very rapidly we needed to solve a capacity shortfall. We now see the same thing in Australia. Very rapidly, someone's going to need to solve a capacity shortfall. And when they look around at all of the tools that we've had for 100 years, they're all insufficient right now to meet that challenge in the time frame we have. And they're turning to storage, just the way California did. So they're turning to storage because it can be deployed where they need it, it can be deployed in the time frame they need it, and it can be cost effective to solve that problem.
Absolutely. I think this idea of just-in-time capacity is a real potential disruptor to the entire planning and regulatory process when it comes to capacity.
Yeah, well, and I think planners, to their credit, they're recognizing that more and more flexibility is an element that they need to plan for. They don't have as static a system into the future. And if you think about anything where volatility is increasing, uncertainty is increasing, you try to build in greater and greater ability to respond to that through flexibility. And I think the tools that planners use haven't completely accommodated this yet. I think we have a lot of work to do there in terms of some of the tools that people do. There's a lot of folks doing very detailed analysis to help show some of these cases, and I think that often is what's needed to illustrate it. But generally, planners are moving to a scenario where they recognize the value of flexibility. And I think we need to be more explicit about that. We recognize flexibility in energy trading and other aspects of the power system. We haven't necessarily recognized it as much in our capacity planning, but I think we're headed there.
Great. Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on stage. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks.